Orphanage. I am adopted. When I was a little girl, I lived in an orphanage called Rue's Home for the Orphaned. I don't remember where it was located because a few months after I was adopted, my new parents moved away to California. I don't even remember what state or country it was located in. What I do remember convinces me never to go looking for it. Rue's Home for the Orphaned was a broken-down, cold little affair. Of what I still remember, there were holes in the ceiling, the fireplace never worked, and the carpets were musty and falling apart. Spiders were more common than food, and the small garden out in the back of the orphanage hadn't grown anything in years, or so I was told. Rue had a small cupboard hidden away where she kept all of the good blankets, so that when winter came we had them ready. Even then we still froze. There were 5 children staying at the orphanage, not including me. There was a pair of twins, 2 small boys who finished each other's sentences or spoke at the same time. The youngest, before me, was a small boy who rarely spoke and always held a bear to his chest. Now that I think about it, I never did wonder how that bear always stayed so clean. The eldest girl would have been a pretty thing, but most of her beauty was lost to the stringiness of her limbs and her bloated belly. She often gave her food away to us smaller ones. The eldest boy, and the eldest in the orphanage, was almost too old to stay there anymore. He did most of the chores around the house, and no matter how little he ate, he always seemed somewhat healthy. He could never sleep, though, and often stared into the dark of the night. There were always dark rings under his eyes, which hardly ever blinked. For their sakes, I won't write their names. Rue was the name of the woman who ran the orphanage. It wasn't the first orphanage that I had ever stayed in, though I don't remember the first orphanage I ever stayed in. You must forgive the small details that I don't remember. I was a very small child then, and for most of my life I've tried to block these memories out. It's the pieces that I do remember that I simply must say. So, Rue was our caretaker. She was once a healthy woman, still plump from the memory of a better life, but most of her skin was sagging. Whatever food she received, she gave to us children, and in return we did our best to care for her. She was a kind woman and always took care of us. Rue was also being abused by her husband. Wit, or Witless, as we children used to call him, was a nasty old man. He ate whatever Rue couldn't get to us in time, and he enjoyed reminding us that he was in charge. He'd never laid a hand on any of us kids, not that I ever knew of, but he often attacked Rue. It was painful to hear her screams and know there was nothing we could do about it. The basement door was always locked. We would sit shivering in our blankets and cry at the cruelty of the world. When I was finally adopted, goodness knows how the kind people who found me did so. It was a jubilation for Rue. She was so happy to finally get one of us out of there, but I was afraid. I was afraid that if I left, Rue would be hurt more so than before. I used to run away from John and Kathy, my adopted parents, and somehow find my way back to that orphanage. I tried to explain to them that Rue was in danger, but I was too little. I couldn't make the absolute danger of the situation clearly known. So I would run away, always hoping to save Rue in some knightly fashion. It was a winter day that I ran to the orphanage. It was much colder than usual. I had stolen some blankets from my adopted parents, which they kindly didn't take back, to bring to the orphanage. I was a good kid, for the most part. I was just so worried. When I arrived at the orphanage, it was clear that things were worse than ever. Wit had found out that Rue had been taking as much food and giving it to the children. Apparently they weren't allowed to have food until he had eaten, which none of us had known about. He was screaming and throwing Rue around the orphanage, something he had never done. If he had ever beat her, it was always in the basement where we couldn't see, or get to. The other children were watching in mute horror, standing on the stairs as if they couldn't believe it. I stood in the open doorway leading out into the dark night. I often ran away at night, dripping mud and trying my hardest to hold on to the massive bundle of blankets that I had momentarily forgotten about. Wit looked up and, seeing me standing in the doorway as per usual, he grew even more furious. He screamed at me, though I don't remember what, something about no longer belonging there, and he hit me. By the time I had pulled myself up off of the ground, everything had changed. Wit was in the air, being strangled by something pale, thin, and gangly. When I looked closer, I realized it was the eldest girl's arms. They had stretched grotesquely, the skin stretching taut and tight, her bones nearly poking through. Her entire body had changed. Her legs had grown grotesquely long, her eyes had disappeared, and her hair had fallen off her head. All that remained was a thin line, like a zipper, where her mouth had been, and she was strangling Wit with her arms. It was then that I noticed that all of the children had changed. The twins' faces had changed to look exactly like the eldest girls. They were clutching at each other, as if afraid, but it looked more frightening than anything else. The youngest boy had dropped his bear, which had dragged itself across the floor and beneath Wit, who was still being strangled. Once there, it had turned into some horrible thing, like a parasite, but bigger. I will admit that of all the horrors there in that room, the bear was the least frightening. The boy's face was also just like that of the twins and the girls. No eyes, just a line where the mouth was, stretching around the back of the head. The eldest boy had changed dramatically. His eyes were massive. Indeed, he was the only one with eyes in the room now, save for me, Wit, and Rue, who was watching somewhat sadly as I cowered on the floor. The boy's body seemed to stretch, his eyes still seeming to grow larger and larger, until I realized that there weren't just 2 eyes, but hundreds of eyes, all grotesquely swollen and covering his face. His mouth was the same zipper line, only it was open, and a dark light seemed to spill from it. He loomed over Wit, who, oddly enough, was still alive. After a moment of staring at the horribly frightened, dying old man, the eldest girl's limbs suddenly slithered loose, and Wit was dropped, straight into the gaping maw of what was once a teddy bear. This is all I remember. I may have passed out, or I may have run home, or maybe I just went mute. I hear that true trauma can sometimes leave you with an empty mind, at least for a while. What I do remember is eventually being in a car, on a road trip, on our way to California. I wish I did know how those children were doing. My parents refused to tell me where it was located, and they won't tell me anything else about it. They don't seem to remember a time where I was traumatized by anything, and so that piece of my memory remains gone. I don't know why I decided to share this. Maybe because I gave up on trying to repress the memories and the nightmares. Perhaps if I accept that this happened to me so very long ago, then maybe the memories will let me rest. Maybe.